Welcome back to my library. I am the eclectic bard, storyteller, and stimulator of the imagination. This is a continuation of Arifureta From Commonplace to World's Strongest by Arifureta. When we last left Hajime from his class, had just been summoned to another world. What dangers may await him, who really knows? Now, there are many differences and many things cut from the anime. Honestly, in my own opinion, the anime did a poor job adapting this series, at least with the first season. It has gotten better since then, and hopefully continues to do so, as season 3 is just around the corner. Again, I do not own the rights to this story. Those belong to the author, Arifureta. I am just here to present it and be entertaining with it. Now, let's catch up with Hajime and his classmates in Arifureta From Commonplace to World's Strongest. Chapter 1. Summoned to another world with a commonplace class. Hajime, who covered his eyes with both hands and kept them tightly shut, slowly realized that the people around him were muttering something, and he timidly opened his eyes. He was struck dumb at the sight of his surroundings. The first thing his eye registered was a massive mural. The mural, which stretched 10 meters long, depicted a faintly smiling figure, whose gender seemed indeterminable. Wreathed in a halo, their blonde hair flowing freely behind them. Behind them in the background were plains, lakes, and mountains. The figure had both arms spread as if trying to grab a hold of all of it. It was a truly beautiful, awe-inspiring work of art. But for some reason, Hajime felt chills run down his spine as he gazed upon it, and he soon averted his eyes. As he examined the rest of his surroundings, he quickly realized that he was in a vast chamber. The entire room was constructed of a gleaming white stone that seemed smooth to the touch. Marble, possibly. Massive pillars with sculptures carved into them rose up to the towering domed ceiling. The room resembled some sort of grand cathedral. Hajime and the others were standing atop a type of plinth located in the deepest recesses of the room. They were raised above their immediate surroundings. Hajime's classmates were all looking around, dumbfounded, just like him. It looked like whatever had happened or affected the entire class. Hajime turned around, looking to see what lay behind him. As he expected, Kaori was slumped on the ground. She didn't seem to have any injuries, so Hajime breathed a sigh of relief. After confirming her safety, Hajime returned his gaze to the crowd of people surrounding him, whom he assumed would be the ones to provide an explanation for their current situation. Indeed, Hajime and his classmates were not the only occupants of the room. Around 30 or so people were standing before the plinth Hajime and the others were on. It looked as if they were all praying, their hands crossed about their chests. They were all clad in robes decorated with gold embroidery, at their sides were something resembling a bishop's stave. The tips of their staves were open into a fan shape, and instead of rings, several flat discs hung from the ends. Eventually, one of the priests stepped forward. He was an old man in his 70s, dressed even more lavishly than his peers, with a richly decorated monk's cap that stood about 30 centimeters tall. Old was perhaps not the best word to describe him. If not for his deeply wrinkled face and aged eyes, one might think him a man in his early 50s. His staff jingled as he walked, clear, soothing notes reverberating throughout the halls all the while. Finally, he opened his mouth and said, "Welcome to Tortoise, brave heroes. It is our pleasure to welcome you here. I am the Pope of the Holy Church, Ishtar Langbad. It is an honor to make your acquaintances." The old man, who called himself Ishtar, broke out into a good-natured smile. He then led the still confused group of students into another room that was furnished with numerous chairs and long tables, saying it would be easier to speak calmly there. The new room he guided the students to was just as lavishly built as the first. The exemplary craftsmanship of the furniture and the tapestries hanging on the walls was evident even to the students' untrained eyes. The layout of the room implied that it was some manner of banquet hall. Aiko Hatayama and Koki's group of 4 all claimed seats at the head of their respective tables, and their followers all arranged themselves around them. Hajime ended up at the very end of his table. The reason no one had made a fuss so far was because everyone was still too busy processing what just happened. Besides, Ishtar had just said he would explain what happened, and Koki, with his max-level charisma, had managed to calm everyone down. Aiko-sensei had tears in her eyes as she watched the student do what she should have been able to do as a teacher. You may be wondering, this stuff could have been in the anime. It would have been a great thing, and more context would have been given to the series. There is a 0 episode, but very few people even know about that. Now, back to the story. The moment everyone had finished seating themselves, a number of carts entered the room, pushed along by a retinue of maids, actual maids to boot, not those sham maids found in certain electronics Holy Land, nor those old plump maids that could still be found in various European countries. They were bona fide maids, the kind every man dreamed of meeting. Even in such an incomprehensible situation, insatiable curiosity and libido drove most of the boys to gaze longingly at the beautiful maids. When the girls saw how they melted over the maids, they glared at the boys in a manner cold enough to freeze hell itself. Hajime was also just about ready to ogle the maid who'd started serving him a drink, but he felt a glacial stare piercing his back and decided to keep his gaze fixed straight ahead. After a moment, he risked a glance back in the direction he felt the stare from, only to see Cowrie beaming happily at him. He decided to pretend he'd never felt anything odd. Ishtar began talking once everyone had been served their refreshments. Now then, I am certain you all must be feeling very confused about the situation you found yourselves in. I shall explain everything, starting from the beginning. All I ask is that you hear me out until the end. Ishtar's explanation was so generic and unreasonable that it seemed as if it come out of a fantasy book template. In short, this was what he said. First, this world was called Tortoise. Within Tortoise lived 3 different races: humans, demons, and demi-humans. Humans resided in the northern half of the continent, demons on the southern half, and demi-humans far to the east within a massive forest. Humans and demons had a strained relationship, having been at war for hundreds of years. Though demons lacked the sheer numbers that humans possessed, their individual strength far surpassed that of most humans, balancing out the difference nicely. Both sides were currently locked in a stalemate, and a major battle hadn't broken out in decades. However, there had been disturbing movements among the demons as of late, namely the fact that they had managed to tame monsters. Monsters were supposedly wild animals that had undergone a magical metamorphosis after having mana poured into them, though it seemed that humans had yet to fully understand the biology of monsters, so they weren't quite sure. They were apparently very powerful and even capable of using magic, which made them an extremely dangerous threat. Up until that point, very few people had been able to tame such ferocious beasts, and even those who could were unable to handle more than 1 or 2 at a time. However, the situation had changed, which means that the only advantage the humans had over the demons, numbers, had been eliminated. As such, humans faced an unprecedented crisis that threatened the existence of their very race. The one who summoned you all here was the blessed Lord Ehit. He is the guardian deity of us humans, and the one true God of the Holy Church, the supreme ruler who created the world itself. I suspect Lord Ehit grew aware of our plight. He realized that humanity was doomed to annihilation, so he summoned you here in order to prevent such a disaster. You heroes are humans from a world greater than ours, and therefore carry within you the strength that surpasses the humans of this world. Ishtar paused for a moment before continuing hesitantly. Or at least, that is what was shown to me in a divine revelation. Regardless, I implore you all to do as Lord Ehit has willed you. Please defeat the demons and save the human race from destruction. He seemed almost in a trance as he said that. He had to have been remembering the time he received that divine revelation. According to Ishtar, over 90% of humans revered the creator god Ehit, and those who received his divine visions were without exception given high-ranking positions in the Holy Church. As Hajime was mulling over how twisted a world must be for for people to happily believe in the will of God without question, and how dangerous such a belief was, someone stood up and began hotly protesting Ishtar's words. That someone was the teacher. Aiko, you can't possibly be serious. You're telling these children to go fight in a war? That's absolutely unacceptable. As a teacher, I cannot allow it. Send this back right this instant. These kids all have families back home who must be worried sick. You can't just kidnap them like this. Each of her words dripped with rather evident anger. Aiko, the mid-20s social studies teacher, was very popular with the kids. She stood only 140 centimeters tall, with a baby face, her hair kept in a neat bob cut. Her childlike appearance, as well as her tendency to run around doing everything she could for the sake of her students, though most of her efforts were for naught, had endeared her to the many. The gap between how hard she tried and how helpful she actually ended up being had made most of the students see her as a kid that needed to be protected more than an adult to be respected. Many of them had taken to calling her by the nickname Ai-chan, though she always grew angry when they did. Since she was aiming to be a respected teacher, she disliked being called by familiar nicknames. This time, too, she flared up at Ishtar to protest the unreasonable, forced summoning in order to look like a proper teacher. Unfortunately, the students regarded her the same as always, thinking something to the effect of, "Look, Ai-chan's at it again, always trying so hard," as she turned to Ishtar. However, Ishtar's next words froze everyone's blood cold. "I understand your feelings. However, I am unable to return you to your world at present." Silence filled the room. The oppressive atmosphere was felt by everyone present. They all stared at Ishtar blankly, unable to properly process what he had just said. "What do you mean, you're unable? If you called us here, you should be able to send us back, shouldn't you?" Aiko-sensei screamed loudly. "As I stated earlier, it is Lord Ihit who summoned you here. The only reason we were in that room at all was to greet you heroes and to offer up our prayers to Lord Ihit. We humans do not possess the power to interfere with other worlds, so whether or not you can return also depends on his will." "No way." Aiko slumped back into her chair. All the strength drained out of her. The other students all started yelling as the truth of Ishtar's words sank in. "You've got to be kidding me! What do you mean we can't go back? You can't do this! Please just send us back somehow! I warn you, can't be serious! Take us the hell back right now!" "This can't be happening, this can't be happening, this can't be happening!" The entire class fell into a panic. Hajime was shaken by this development as well, but because he was an otaku, he had at least seen countless books and games that had the same premise, which was why he was able to determine that it was not the worst possible scenario. That was the reason he was at least somewhat calmer than the other students. For reference, the worst case scenario he was imagining was the one in which they all got summoned as slaves. Ishtar said nothing and silently watched on as all the students panicked. Though Ishtar was silent, Hajime thought he could see contempt hidden within the depths of the old man's eyes. Hajime presumed he was thinking, "These people were chosen by God. Why are they not rejoicing?" Or something along those lines. Koki stood up amidst the hysterical group of students and slammed his fist down onto the table with a bang that managed to get the attention of most of the kids. Once he had confirmed that everyone's eyes were on him, Koki began speaking. "Everyone, there's no point in complaining to Ishtar. There's nothing he can do about it now. And I, at least, have decided to stand and fight. These people are about to be annihilated. Knowing that, how can I possibly leave them to such a tragic fate? And besides, if we've been summoned here to save humanity, it's possible we'll be allowed to go back once we've saved them. Well, Ishtar-san, do you think that's possible?" "It is as you say. Lord Ehit is not so unkind that he would ignore a request from his chosen heroes. And we've all gained some amazing powers, right? Ever since I arrived here, it's felt like I've somehow grown way stronger." "Yes, that is correct. It would be safe to assume that each of you have the equivalent strength of anywhere from a few to a few dozen regular men." "All right. Then we should be fine. I'm going to fight. If we save everyone, then we can go home. So just you watch. I'm going to save everyone, including us." Koki clenched his fists tightly as he proclaimed his noble intentions, flashing an almost sickeningly, dazzling smile at the end. At the same time, his overwhelming charisma started taking effect. Students who were despairing mere moments ago began to regain their sense of composure. They all looked at Koki with wonder, as if they were staring at hope itself. Most of the female students had adoration mixed into their gaze as well. "Knew you'd say that. Still, I'd be worried letting you go up all on your own, which is why I'm coming with you." "Ryutaro, looks like that's the only choice we have right now. It pisses me off that we don't get any real say in the matter, but I'll help too. Shizuku, if Shizuku's Chan's going to fight, then I will too." "Kaori?" The usual group of friends all chimed in with their support for the Koki. Swept along by the flow, the rest of the students naturally all agreed to fight as well. Aiko-sensei was in tears as she ran between her students, imploring them to stop. However, she was ultimately powerless, completely unable to keep Koki's charisma from infecting the rest of the class. In the end, everyone agreed to help fight in this world's war. However, most students probably had no idea what war was really like, nor did they even want to fathom it. In a sense, they might have just been trying to escape from reality to preserve their own sanity. Hajime was considering all of those factors as he observed Ishtar out of the corner of his eye. Ishtar had a rather satisfied smile on his face, something which Hajime took note of. Ishtar had been discreetly monitoring Koki as he had given his speech, mentally jotting down how he reacted to which words. Koki, who had always had a strong sense of justice, had reacted quickly when Ishtar spoke of the tragedy that had befallen the human race, and Ishtar had made sure to emphasize the cruelty and brutality of the demons when he saw Koki's reaction to his words. After all, it was obvious that Ishtar had seen right through Koki. he had realized who among their group held the most influence. Hajime supposed that as the top leader of the global religious institution, it stood to reason that Ishtar would be so discerning, but he still mentally filed him away as someone to watch out for. Regardless, since they had chosen to assist the humans in their war, they now needed to learn how to fight. No matter how amazing their newfound powers were, they were still high school students that had been living in the peaceful country of Japan. It would have been impossible for them to just start fighting against the demons and monsters without any training. However, it seemed Ishtar had prepared for that eventuality as well, since he explained to the students that there were people ready to receive them in the Hylic Kingdom. Said kingdom was apparently at the foot of the Divine Mountain, and the temple they were currently in was the head temple of the Holy Church that stood at its summit. The kingdom had very close ties with the Holy Church. According to the legend, one of Ehud's progeny, Sharamban, had founded the kingdom. Of all the human kingdoms, it was apparently the one with the richest history. The fact that the church's most sacred temple was in the kingdom's backyard spoke volumes about how deep their connection ran. Hajime and the others headed for the temple's front gate. They were about to embark on their journey to the kingdom below. As they walked through the grand triumphal arches that comprised the main gate of the temple, they were greeted by an endless sea of clouds. Because no one had suffered from altitude sickness, they hadn't realized they'd been so high up. Hajime assumed that magic had something to do with making the environment around the temple habitable. They all stood in wonder as they stared at the clear blue sky and the waves of clouds sparkling in the sunlight. Ishtar looked on proudly as everyone gawked, before urging them onward. As they made their way forward, they came upon a massive, white, circular pedestal that was surrounded by a fence. They walked through the lavish hallway made of the same white stone as the cathedral, and stepped up onto the pedestal. Engraved within the stone of the pedestal was a large magic circle. On the other side of the fence lay a steep drop to the clouds below. So both students huddled as close to the center of the pedestal as they could. But they were unable to restrain their curiosity and timidly glanced around their surroundings despite their fear. As they were looking around, Ishtar began to chant. Faith is a key that opens the road to heaven. Celestial path. The magic circle began emitting a blinding light as he finished chanting. The entire pedestal began gliding down toward the ground, as if attached to some invisible cable. It appeared that Ishtar's chant had been an activation signal of sorts. It functioned exactly like a fantasy cable car. The students all started clamoring excitedly as they saw their first display of magic. There was quite the ruckus when they passed through the sea of clouds, too. Once on the other side, the students could finally make out the ground below. Directly below them was a huge city, or rather a small kingdom. A huge castle that looked as if it were jutting out of the mountainside lay at its center, with the rest of the city spreading outward in a circle. The capital city of Hylic. The magical cable car seemingly ran from the Holy Church down to the roof of one of the castle's towers via some aerial pathway. Hajime smiled sardonically at the extravagant theatrics. The entire journey had clearly been crafted to resemble God's disciples descending down from heaven, or some such feat. It was quite likely that with a display so ostentatious, some of the more ardent believers would come to worship not just Hajime and his companions, but the priests of the order who had escorted them down as well. Hajime recalled what he had read in history books about pre-war Japan, a time when religion and politics were very closely tied to each other. And it was those very ties that had brought about a great tragedy. In the end, it was quite possible that this world was even more twisted than ancient Japan was. After all, this was a world in which a supernatural being powerful enough to interfere with other worlds existed. It wouldn't have been surprising at all if the whole world literally revolved around God's will. This entire world, including everyone's chances of returning home, all rested in the palm of God's hand. As the outline of the capital grew more detailed, Hajime felt an inexplicable sense of unease well up inside him. He shook away the oppressive thoughts and reminded himself that he had to focus on doing what he could for the time being. The moment they landed atop the royal palace, Hajime and the others were escorted to the throne room. The hallways they passed on their way were every bit as ostentatious as the temple had been. Along the way, they passed by knights, servants, maids, and government officials. Everyone who passed gazed at the students with a mixture of awe and wonder. It seemed that most people were aware of who the students were. Hajime's sense of unease continued to increase, and he furtively followed behind everyone at the end of the procession. Ishtar and the party of heroes finally found themselves standing before a pair of massive double doors, into which numerous beautiful designs had been engraved. 2 guards were standing at attention on either side of the door, and they loudly announced the group's arrival to whoever was waiting within. Then, without waiting for a reply, they swung the doors open. Ishtar leisurely passed through the entrance, clearly at ease. All the students timidly followed behind him, with the exception of Koki and his friends, who were seemingly unaffected by the splendor surrounding them. Within the room stretched a long red carpet that ended at the far wall. At its end lay a magnificent chair, or rather throne. Standing in front of the throne was a middle-aged man who radiated an aura of solemn dignity. Next to him was presumably the queen, and next to her were a boy and a girl, both with blonde hair and striking blue eyes. The boy, who was the younger of the two, seemed no more than 10 years old, while the girl must have been around 14 or 15. On the left side of the carpet was a line of soldiers, all clad in armor and uniforms. On the right, a line of civil officers. Altogether, there were probably around 30 people waiting in the room. Once they were directly before the throne, Ishtar left the students and went to stand beside the king. He then proffered his hand to the king, who took it reverently and kissed it with the slightest brush of his lips. It looked like the Pope was even more important than the king. Hajime sighed inwardly, as he was now certain that God ran the kingdom. A flurry of self-introductions followed after that. The king's name was Elihide S.B. Heilig, and his wife, the queen, was called Lulu Aria. The blonde boy was the prince Lundell, and the girl the princess Liliana. Then came introductions for the knight captain, the prime minister, and other important dignitaries. As an aside, the fact that the young prince's eyes were glued onto Cowrie the whole time made it clear that her charm worked on men of this world as well. Once the introductions had finished, a huge feast was laid out, and the students were able to enjoy the dishes of a parallel world. Though, for the most part, it wasn't very different from Western food back on Earth. The pink sauce and rainbow-colored drinks that were sometimes brought out were especially delicious. Prince Lundell spent most of the meal talking with Cowrie, and all the other boys stared on at them worriedly. Padme secretly hoped the brunt of their jealousy would move away from him and onto the prince instead. No, he didn't really expect a 10-year-old boy to have much of a chance with Cowrie. After they finished their meal, Padme and the others were introduced to the instructors they would be training with in return for being clothed and fed by the palace. Their instructors had been chosen from the ranks of active-duty knights and court magicians. The king probably wanted to strengthen the relationship between the students and his kingdom for the inevitable war to come. Once dinner and introductions were finished, everyone was led to their own individual rooms. Padme was certain he wasn't the only one who was dumbstruck by the huge canopy bed he found in his room. The room was so luxurious that he couldn't fully relax, but he'd already experienced quite the hectic day, so he was tired. He flopped down on his bed and fell asleep almost instantly as the tension drained out of him. That's where we're going to end for the day. So, Padme and his classmates get summoned to another world by this all-powerful god named Edith, who refuses to send them back regardless. Though, according to Ishtar, the god will send them back if they do what they are told. But the real question is, can we even trust Ishtar? And can we trust anyone in that church at all? So if you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And this has been the Eclectic Bard. Have a good day.